Policy-based lending, or PBL, is a flexible lending modality used by development partners for policy reforms and crises management. What is the role of PBL during crises situations? What are the success factors in designing and implementing PBLs? And what are the challenges in measuring and evaluating them? How can PBL operations be used to address regional and global public goods? Listen to what experts have to say on From Crisis Recovery to Long-Term Development, Role of Policy-Based Lending.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's session on the role of policy-based lending and budget support operations as our developing member countries transition from the focus on the pandemic recovery measures and to tackling longer-term challenges posed by rising inequality, still very prevalent poverty rates, inequality, challenges posed by climate change, just to name a few. As the video has already set the context or the questions that we'll be addressing in the course of the session, perhaps I'll go straight to the introduction of our panelists. We have put together a very distinguished panel this morning to answer all our burning questions about the role of policy-based lending. First, next to me, we have Mr. Ferry Irawan. He's the Deputy Minister for Macroeconomic and Financial Coordination at the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs in Indonesia.
Morning.
He also serves as Assistant Minister for Regional Development. And before joining CMEA, Pak Ferry was Division Director for Macroeconomic Research, Fiscal Division, and Monetary and Balance of Payments Division in the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia. Warm welcome to Mr. Ferry. Next to Pak Ferry, we have Mr. Mark Sundberg, whom many of you have met during the last couple of days. Mr. Sundberg is the Millennium Challenge Corporation's Chief Economist and Deputy Vice President in the Department for Policy and Evaluation. And before joining MCC, Mr. Sundberg also had a long career in the World Bank, covering different aspects of economic management, country evaluation, as well as country economist for several country programs. Welcome again, Mark. Next to Mark, we have Ms. Emma Vev. Emma is the Deputy Director General of the Southeast Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank. In Emma's 18 years with ADB, she has had considerable experience in leading the design and implementation of policy-based operations or budget support. A few highlights of Emma's career include supporting the development of the precautionary financing option for the Cook Islands as it recovers from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as in guiding Fiji's resilience-focused policy-based operations. She also oversaw the piloting of ADB's first contingent disaster financing program and the widespread uptake of this modality across the Pacific. And more recently, Emma has been working on the strategic planning of the country operations, policy-based lending, and the quality oversight of operations in the Southeast Asia Department. And last but not least, we have Jeff Chelsky. He's the Manager for Country Programs and Economic Management Unit in the Independent Evaluation Group of IEG. Since 2018, Jeff has led the Economic Management and Country Programs Unit in the World Bank's IEG. Among other things, he has also overseen the country program evaluation and thematic evaluations in the macroeconomic, fiscal, debt, and governance spaces. And also recently, he has led the design of the IEG's methodology in evaluating budget support operations. So with that brief introduction, maybe a few words on the format of the session. We have 1 hour, so we have to be very efficient. And I would like to keep it as conversational as possible. We will go through 2 rounds of questions with each of the panelists. And if time permits, we may have some time for another round or some follow-up questions. But we'll be sure to leave some enough time at the end to take some questions from the audience. Okay, so with that, let's get started. Mark, maybe I can start with you. As we all know, PBLs have been used by development partners for many years, decades in fact. Still, this modality is not always well understood and also has tended to be controversial at times. So to get the discussion started, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the evolution of PBLs and especially why the modality has been controversial as well. Please, Mark.
Well, thank you, Sona. Thanks to the ADB and organizers of this, I think, fabulous event, the Asian Evaluation Week. I'll say a little bit about the history of, I'm going to call it budget support. There's so many acronyms they deal with, but all of these deal with different forms of budget support from our agencies. There's a long history of budget support. Probably goes back to Grecian and Roman times in exchange for trading opportunities, other things of that sort. But in the modern aid and foreign assistance era, and starting really at the Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Plan was one that provided budget support in the reconstruction of Europe. What I think all of us here are familiar with is the early evolution of budget support from the late 70s through 2000, when it was often referred to as structural adjustment lending, and it gained rather a bad reputation. Bad reputation based on a number of elements. I should say that early on, budget support was aimed at addressing balance of payments imbalances. It evolved in the 90s to more broadly deal with fiscal imbalances, government budget imbalances. And then from the late 90s on, it's really been unplugged. Often there is very little connection between the amount being provided and the underlying needs of the country. But the bad reputation of structural adjustment lending came from very onerous conditionality. There have been programs, especially when there's multi-donor support, that have had 30 or more conditions in the old structural adjustment loans. It was also often out of sync with the budget process, so that predictability of support and tranching that came from early budget support operations was problematic for fiscal management in countries. It was also seen as being driven by the Washington Consensus, looking at deregulation, at policy reforms that were one size fits all in the sense exchange rate flexibility things, trade restrictions, those things associated with what was called the Washington Consensus. In 2005, really since 2000, but what was a watershed event, 2005, the Paris Declaration brought in significant reforms to budget lending. It aimed for far less conditionality. It aimed for putting countries in the driver's seat, so country ownership was key. It saw that as a tripartite arrangement between bilaterals, multilaterals, and development partners. It aimed for greater fiscal predictability, and it was seen at that time, 2005 and on, from many as what would become a much more dominant form of support for development. In fact, it hasn't really evolved that way. After a period of some stronger support, that was diminished in many bilaterals, and there have been caps that have been imposed in multilateral development banks. What is the source of that controversy? What has driven that? I think there are two main critiques of budget support. There are more than two, but the two principal ones is concern over fungibility. When you provide budget support, what do you know that is being spent on? And that's, I should mention, by the way, that my own government, the US government, has not been a supporter of budget support in its foreign aid, foreign assistance. The second challenge is intangibility. I think governments like to point and taxpayers like to see that assistance is going to building a bridge you can cross a river on, or schools that children will be educated in. When you say it's a slice of support to a government budget, it's very hard to justify that to a parliament or to Congress. Proponents of budget support have argued that the basic instrument is a question, it's one of dialogue, analytic work, coming to agreement, understanding, supporting priorities of the government. That government ownership is key to that, and we know that without ownership, you will not be able to move reforms forward. And I think another argument for it is efficiency, to get funds out quickly, but also sort of the preparatory cost per dollar released, or whatever currency, is much lower with budget support. So those are proponents argue for those benefits, and opponents have talked about fungibility as a concern and the sort of intangibility of support. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. Excellent overview, and it really helps, I think, set the scene in terms of our discussion during this session, and we'll repeatedly come back to some of the key highlights that you mentioned in terms of the move from conditionality to government-led and government-owned reform agenda, the importance of predictability, and I'm sure Pa Ferry will touch upon that in terms of budget support, and some of the misunderstanding and I would say skepticism around this whole issue about fungibility of budget support and not for those of us who are used to sort of clearly earmarked investment project type of modalities. So with that, let me now turn to Pa Ferry. You, of course, represent the developing country perspective, and Indonesia has a large reform agenda, and also it's unfortunately prone to crises, both economic, financial, as well as natural disasters and so on. So Indonesia has had a lot of experience with PBLs. So from your perspective, what are some of your experience in terms of the importance of PBLs and how to make them more useful and effective in the context of your country? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sona, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, of course, for inviting us in here, Bu Sona and ADB. I think it's very important agenda and event. As you mentioned that, I know all of us really know that we are right now living in very dynamic world. And as we record, for example, 2020, we deal with the COVID, and of course, how to deal with the COVID, the health aspect and the economics aspect. And then in 2022, we have deal with the inflation, the commodity rise, the geopolitical tension, etc. This is very, very challenging, even for, especially for our case, as developing countries. Given that dynamic in a global economy, I think we have a record still on a good economic performance. Our economic growth is around 5% for last 6 quarters. It's also accompanied by low and stable inflation. Last inflation record is around 3%, and we hope that until the end of this year, we can maintain that, the 3% as the government target. And also it's accompanied by the poverty rate declining. During the COVID, for example, our poverty rate is 10%, with some program intervention by the government. It's right now declined to 9.3%. Of course, in our experience, the role of the government budget is very crucial, very important. I think this role in this case is in 3 ways, Bu Sona, ladies and gentlemen. First, of course, the countercyclical instrument policy. The second, as shock absorber for this external shock. And that one is the enabler for the structural reform. So I think these 3 roles, they have strong connection with what Mark mentioned and Bu Sona mentioned about the budget support. I mean, the strong budget It's not strong if we don't have any instrument to support that, both on the market or from the developing partner like the ADB, World Bank, MCC, or other developing partner. During the crisis of the COVID, you can see on the slide, in 2020, for example, before the COVID, our growth is around 5%. Because of this COVID and the mobility restriction, our growth is become contraction, -2.1. This is the first time since the Asian financial crisis, 1998. With the role of the government budget to mitigate this, to address this, we introduced what we call the COVID handling and economic recovery program. Of course, because the challenge is quite high, we have to make sure that we have all the resource to achieve the program. That's why there is some extraordinary measure that we introduced during that 2020 until 2022. For example, Indonesia has a very rigid rule for the deficit. We have a 3% rules for the deficit. This is we introduced since long ago. Because we have all the resources we need, in 2020 we relaxed these rules. We relaxed these 3 rules, so we can design the budget for the early designing. As the slides show, the deficit is designed minus 1.76% of our GDP. But because of the challenge of the COVID, and also we use the extraordinary measure, we designed the budget is around minus 6% of our GDP, because the health aspect, and then we also cover all the economic recovery program. This is we optimize this, and the role of the PBL can be seen also in this graph. The implementing of relaxing the 3% rule have implication that usually in our deficit, the deficit is around 300 trillion rupiahs. But because of these COVID measures in 2020, the deficit become 3 times larger, from 300 trillion rupiah to 900 trillion rupiah. Of course, again, this is really have a need budget financing. The market, yes, but because the market is also dynamic, we have also cooperation with the central bank to finance this deficit. The other important instrument is that the program loan. As be seen in this chart, for example, from the program loan or the PBL in 2019, the PBL only cover around 36.7 trillion rupiah. But because of extraordinary measure to handle the COVID and economic recovery, the role of PBL become also larger, 3 times in line with the deficit, from 36.7 trillion rupiah to become 102.3 trillion rupiah, 3 times larger compared to the normal situation. So I think this is the first role, Bu Sona, ladies and gentlemen, is become the budget support, especially if we want to implement this extraordinary measure to support the budget financing for achieving the specific target or the grand design on the target of the government program. The second rule of this budget is, like I mentioned, is enabler for the structural reform that we need to do. In Indonesia's case, I think the government has consistently doing this extra effort for this structural reform. Even though in the short run in 2020 until 2022, we have so busy to handling the COVID and make sure that we have on track on the recovery. During that time, we also simultaneously doing this economic reform. At least there's still 3 laws that we introduced to as a commitment to the sector reform. First, of course, the Job Creation Act is like the grand design of how we want to simplify our permit, how we more open to investor, how we want to strengthen the SMEs, and how we want to have a big support for the worker. This is the first law that we introduced to doing this sector reform. The second rule about this adjustment of the tax laws, Bu Sona, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, additional 3% of our budget deficit, of course, in the future, we should pay for that deficit, the debt specifically. To doing that, to anticipate that, we adjust some tax rule by implementing this new rule during the 2020 and 2022. The second rule that we introduced to show the strong commitment is that to issue what we call the financial interlink between the central and provincial government. I think it's also another strong laws that we introduced to show the strong commitment on the structural reform. We're doing that to achieve, we have the long-term target. I mean, right now, the realization of our economic growth is around 5%. We have what we call the Indonesian Vision 2045. To achieve that vision, we have to pursue the economic growth around 6 till 7%. That's why the strong policy for introducing investment, the increasing the export, the policy for industrialization and competitiveness is several policy that we introduced to doing this structural reform. Policy-based loan has important role for our case to supporting policy reform in systematic and well-sequenced manner. Bu Sona, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, by designing the PBL, we have a strict schedule. I mean, for early designing, making the policy metrics, and then disbursing, we have to comply with the schedule designed by the development partner. For example, in this case, in ADB, what date, which month, what year should be done. I think we should strict on that. To comply this schedule, we design this policy-based loan by introducing what we call the policy matrix. The specific policy when should be finished this policy, so this in line with the PBL or the schedule discussing with the developing partner. I think make sure that all the reform can be done in systematic and well-sequenced manner, using the policy, the time, and then the outcome that we should achieve. Because in PBL, we also have, besides this policy matrix, I think, we also have specific target should we achieve. Like, for example, the economic growth, the investment needed, etc. So I think this is the second role that can achieve by this, using the optimizing the policy-based loan as a budget support. So I think, as a conclusion, the role of PBL I think is very important in our case. First, of course, the budget support, the financing need, not through the line ministers, but to support the budget directly. The second one about the helping us supporting policy reform by make sure that we all discipline with the target, with the schedule, with other process that should comply to achieve the timeline that been agreed with the different partner. So I think I will stop here, Bu Sona. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pak Ferry, for illustrating very clearly from Indonesia's perspective the importance of PBLs, both from the development financing perspective as well as importantly on the reform agenda front. So Jeff, turning to you and going to the important topic of evaluation of PBLs. What is the track record? I know there are some methodological issues in terms of evaluating PBLs, which we hopefully can get to in the next round. But in terms of the available evidence, what do you see overall trends across different modalities and sort of key findings and lessons? Thank you.
No, thank you very much for the question. And I think Mark mentioned that at one point in time, budget support operations were going out of fashion and they were less popular. But more recently, we've seen a resurgence in demand for them. So my interest in the topic as an evaluator is how to ensure that they're as impactful as they can possibly be. And as you said, I'll talk about the innovations in evaluation. But in order to understand their track record and their success, it's important to understand what they are. And Mark referred to them as, I think, an engagement tool. They are not projects. And I think for too long, they were evaluated, they were viewed as projects, and I think that's part of perhaps the disappointment in them. They're engagement tools, they need to be seen in a broader context. And the most important thing to realize is the financing and the reforms that are supported by it, or the conditionality, are unrelated. The money does not go to finance the reforms that are supported by the budget support operation. It takes a while for people to get their head around that because it's counterintuitive. But understanding that is key to understanding how they can be successful and when they can be successful. So I would differentiate two situations. One is the crisis context, the other is non-crisis context. And I think they have been most successful in the crisis context. And COVID is a perfect example. Part of what happens in a crisis context is the financing becomes much, much more important. Often it provides counter-cyclical support, it helps maintain basic services. In some cases, it makes the difference between being able to pay public sector salaries and not paying public sector salaries. It, I think, allows a lot of stability in planning that would not otherwise be there. And as I said, COVID has an overabundance of examples, and in being able to purchase vaccines and ramp up healthcare spending, it often was the determining factor. And I could go through all the examples of the DPOs, PBLs, that were involved in COVID, and without exception, the healthcare side of it, the fact that that money enabled governments to provide health services, was unambiguously successful. Now, the reform side of that is more complicated, because in order for the reforms to actually be successful, and this is perhaps where some of the expectations have been misaligned with the ex post experience, is particularly in a crisis context, as soon as the crisis hit, it's the worst time to decide what your priorities are. And often we don't have the diagnostic work and the analytical work in place to know where we should focus our attention. Where they have worked best is when there's a clear sense of what the priorities need to be in that particular country. And of course, within the context of what the government program is, but there's greater demand for reforms than there is time or capacity to implement them. My sense is what has proven most effective is when the diagnostics have been used in the past to identify weaknesses in public financial management, public investment management, public expenditure management. Because in a crisis context, suddenly resources become scarce, and you want to make sure that you make the best of them that you possibly can. But diagnosing what needs to be fixed in a crisis is terrible. It's a very difficult thing. There's some really interesting examples in the Caribbean. Dominica is the one that strikes me, and part of their COVID recovery plan is to use infrastructure to drive the economy out of it. But they had a very clear picture beforehand, because of diagnostic and analytical work, where the weaknesses were in their public investment management system, their public procurement system. And so the reforms that were included in the budget support operation were changing the laws on procurement, et cetera, et cetera. And this will allow them to make more out of the scarce resources going forward. Often, if that work is not done, there's a grasping for low-hanging fruit, things that appear to be important but are not addressing binding constraints. And I think the best example is in COVID, pre-COVID, there was a huge resurgence in debt stress among many, many developing countries. And the focus in COVID, when we recognized that that was on top of an already bad situation on debt, was on transparency, because transparency was an easy thing to address. Let's publish a debt strategy, as opposed to let's actually look at the drivers of that debt in the first place. That's more complicated, that takes time, that slows down the budget support. So I think the answer to where they're most effective in a crisis context is when you already know what your reform priorities are and how you want to go about them, because then you can take those reforms, accompany it with the financing that you need for countercyclical support, and move forward. But also not just crises. In fact, you see them a lot in fragile states where the revenue base dries up. And I think of Iraq and Chad were two examples where the budget support operation made the difference between being able to pay public service salaries or not. And had they not been paid, you can imagine what would have happened if the government ceased to function. So that's the long answer to the short question.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, for highlighting some of the success factors and also the importance of differentiating between PBLs during crisis times and regular sort of reform-based PBLs. So Emma, now you've heard from a client, from an evaluator, and you bring the operations perspective. So from your experience and in relation to key aspects such as the quality of policy engagement, the diagnostic work, which again is one of the important lessons in terms of some of the success factors. Perhaps you can share how you, from operations, approach PBLs in different contexts and what are some of the challenges you face. Thanks.
Thanks, Sona, and thanks for the invitation from IED to join this panel on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I might place myself in Mark's interesting history of PBLs. So I came to them just as they started to take off again, around 2008, 2009. I started working on my first PBL, and so I had the advantage of the work of evaluators and my own experience of sitting on a government side of a desk discussing PBLs with ADB and other big donors to understand some of the practical problems that you run into in making them happen. And I think that put me in a good position to really think through how to make these operations work for the countries and to ensure that the money the bank was lending was doing as much good as it possibly could. I think definitely there's three really important pillars to budget support, and one of those pillars is the quality analysis, quality assessments, which guide us to understand what to do and how to sequence that. Now that involves a step beyond the assessments because you can run into the risk of being too perfectionist about it. You know, you have PFAs and DEMPAs and other things, all with 20 to 30 indicators and ratings, and you can very, very quickly end up with 100 plus must-do, need to do it right now things, which is the antithesis of what we want to do. We want to dive in through all that and identify a short set of really critical things to help unlock the problems that the economy is running into. And so that means we have to go beyond what's in the assessment, and we have to make use of policy dialogue between the partners in the lead, the government, a range of people in the government because they come with different views, and where possible, other development partners. So we have a coordinated message and an agreement around what is needed to be done. And I think that's one critical pillar. Now, the other really important pillar, I think Pak Ferry gave a really good example of that, is a willing and reformist government. And we've seen that in Indonesia. And it's a balance. If you've got a government where everyone agrees this is what needs to be done, they can pick it up and run with it, and they really don't necessarily need budget support behind that. Maybe a little bit of TA to fill capacity gaps would do. But where you have lead ministries, finance, perhaps wanting to push some things that their colleagues are not so happy with, that's where budget support can really come in and provide that carrot. So the Minister of Finance can go to their colleagues and say, look, this is critical. What will it take to get you to move forward on this? And so I think that's where the dollars behind budget support come in. It allows the Finance Minister to ensure that colleagues are behind the reforms that they will focus on. And the third pillar, as others have said, is a solid budget. As a development institute, we can't pour money into a budget where it's leaking everywhere or where it's being spent on things that are working against the development of the country. And I think that comes back to a point that if you're going to do budget support, you do have to be willing at some point in time to say no, that this is the line we cannot move beyond. And I think the analytics guide you to that. The policy dialogue helps you avoid getting to that line. But there's cases that I've personally seen where governments have wanted to have massive salary increases that are unsustainable, or massive funds transfers to SOEs that are again unsustainable, where budget support isn't working and isn't pushing the right reforms. So I think those things are quite critical to think about, and recognising that budget support is part of a sort of a whole environment of things. It's not just the money given to government and the reforms, it's the technical assistance needed to do the reforms, it's the knowledge, it's the long policy dialogue with government before you get to a point where you can agree on key actions to be done. And it's also the investments that help the policy reforms put in place actually work, investments in public financial IT systems, etc. So it's a whole package of things that all need to be thought about and juggled. So I really feel like you can't be a perfectionist about it. You have to make good, solid judgments about what is enough and what will work in this situation.
Great.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much, Emma. I especially note the point you make in relation to the need to be able to sometimes say no, which is never easy, given that you're working with important clients, have long-term relationships to maintain. But I think that's where, again, the analytical underpinnings and the diagnostics can be your friend. So I think this brings me very nicely to the next question I had for Pat Ferry, which is about reform ownership. It's never easy to drive difficult reforms, especially, of course, in Indonesia, the complex context of Indonesia. There are always winners and losers in every reform, at least in the short term. And of course, related to that, there are some can be vested interests and multiple stakeholders. So in this context, and your ministry, of course, plays a key role in terms of coordinating and driving reforms. So if you could please briefly share, illustrate again your example and experience in the Indonesia context in terms of building reform ownership, but also how you incentivize different ministries which don't actually see the money, because the money goes to the central budget, right? So yes, please, Pak Ferry, please share a little bit on your experience.
Before I answer that question, I think I note two keywords from Pak Mark and Bu Emma. First, of course, when Pak Mark mentioned about the reform priorities, and then Bu Emma mentioned about the long policy dialogue. I think these two keywords are also relevant for our case. For the reform priority, for example, how to make all the relevant agencies agree with all of us and want to follow all the plan that we will design. I think one of these is to define clear reform priority. In our case, to ensure the program has strong ownership, usually we quote or we follow what the highest level government development plans, or if there's some cabinet meeting or the ministerial meeting that decided is on several policy, we use that policy or direction as an anchor for discussing, designing, and implementing this policy matrix. Using this high-level direction, it makes sure that all the relevant agencies or ministries follow with us. For example, like the PBL that we discussed with ADB, the CITA program, is the trade acceleration, the investment and competitiveness is one of the area reform that we all agreed in the government. So when we introduce this, all the relevant ministries agree with us. Of course, there's some technical or detailed discussion, but because we have on the the same strategy, the grand strategy, they at the end follow design that we discussed. The second important things also is better coordination and communication. Better, what I mean is that more regular, more frequent coordination between all parties related to this PBL. At least there is 3 parties that involved in this PBL. First, of course, the developing partner like ADB or World Bank, and the other like the coordinator or executing agencies. In our case, it's in my office. And the second, of course, the implementing agencies. The executing agencies have a fundamental role in connecting between the developing partners and the implementing agencies, because the first interaction, of course, between the executing agencies and these developing partners. The result of discussion, we should introduce, we should explain to the implementing agencies. If we have this frequent and regular meeting, I think we will have the same page, we have the same frequency, and then it's much easier to implement the policy matrix. The other things that implementing agencies understand the objective of DPL and the importance of support of implementing agency. It's also important factor in strengthening their engagement with the program. When we early meeting, we start the meeting with the implementing agencies. The first meeting is not about the substance or the policy matrix, but about the arrangement, especially when we say about loan, and then we'll ask question, who's owner of this loan? Where money will come to this loan? Their office or to the Minister of Finance? And then after that, they will discuss about this policy. So make a clear understand about this arrangement, I think is important. First, we make sure that they aware that what we do for the next step is important. Why? Because the budget needs support for this PBL to finance other priority programs of the government. And the other is, of course, they will keep asking question. To solve this, Bu Emma also mentioned about technical assistance. Even though all the money will come to the Minister of Finance budget, or the Treasury's office, but for the specific reform that they want to do, we also have this technical assistant. The technical assistant will support them by deploying the international best practice, the knowledge of this new process business that we want to introduce. This will also motivate them that when we decide and agree with this policy matrix, they have the channeling support, which knowledge, which expert will come to help them to design this policy matrix or the reform. This is the second critical. The other things that the active communication from development partner is also key to the successful implementation. I mean, after we have this pleno meeting, usually the development partner accompanied by my team will come bilaterally to these implementing agencies. The pleno meeting, of course, we can talk, we can discuss, but only on general term. More detail we'll do in this bilateral meeting. So they have, they get more deepened idea about what they should do, and then what kind of support they can tap for implement or doing this reform. So I think this the second important thing that we must do to get more bonding on the related parties in this PBL. The other thing is that important is that all parties in program preparation, implementation, and evaluation, there is strong involvement between those three parties: the development partner, executing agencies, and of course the implementing agencies. Usually, when we design this early stage, our office will discuss with the development partner, in this case is ADB, what the economic condition, what the challenge, and what the government priority. And then development partner or ADB will help us designing the initial draft for this policy matrix, the grand strategy, the grand issue that we want to, to be accomplished. And then there's some, the pleno meeting, the one-on-one meeting, then we have the draft that more solid or more finalized one. That draft we discuss, and of course there is some update. We also update to that program. And the other thing that's important is the monitoring and evaluation meeting. Usually, the monitoring and evaluation meeting will be done after the program or the PBL is finished. To government employee that frequent turnover, I think sometimes it become create difficulties. I mean, when the monitoring and evaluation team come and ask us for data and more document, as an evidence document, if there's lag between the implementation of the policy metric and the monitoring evaluation, sometimes the official who in charge on these issues will be moved to other area. It quite difficult because it means that we should, explaining again what the program is, what the data needed, and the documentation needed. In right now arrangement, we do this monitoring evaluation in the pleno meeting quite regular. We design twice a year, so we have a frequent and regular meeting. So the challenge on the turnover is not there again. So we have the updating policy, the data, and we then, if there's some needed, we can then send to development partner to those documents and data. And I think again, that's all the lesson from Indonesian case. So basically, based on the lesson learned, I think the strong communication, strong coordination between three important parties: the development partner, the executing agencies, and the implementation is very important. And then the more frequent and more regular monitoring meeting is so important to make sure that we have the right person and the right data to monitor all the target, to monitor the policy. And of course, the technical assistance is good incentive for the implement agencies to make sure that there's someone that can help them to fulfill the policy promise. Thank you, Bu Sona.
So a lot of coordination and communication across ministries, and also you highlighted the importance of monitoring and evaluation in the process. Jeff, you alluded to this earlier, but very briefly. I'm mindful of the time. If you could please highlight some of the key features of the new methodology on PBLs, just at the conceptual level, the difference between PBLs and more traditional investment loans, please. Thank you.
Clear about is we're evaluating, when we do an evaluation of a PBL, we're evaluating the bank's performance. We're not evaluating the borrower's performance. We're not evaluating their reform program. There's only so much you can evaluate, and don't want to over-determine the system. And so the first thing that we did is we actually dropped the rating for borrower performance, because we didn't want a situation where the bank approved a PBL, knew that there was capacity constraints or a lack of ownership, and then when it failed to meet its targets, the justification was there was no ownership or lack of capacity. So part of what we assess is the ex-ante discussion of risk when the bank brings forward the operation. So we'll look for whether or not they've recognized things like capacity constraints, and then we'll look at the mitigating measures that they've identified. So if capacity is a problem, we would expect the bank to either itself or in collaboration with development partners or some other entity find some way of addressing that constraint, because you want to have impact. And that's a key difference. Now, the other thing that we do is we used to rate the relevance of objectives, but with most budget support operations, the objectives are very high level, and they're the sorts of things that no one would ever disagree with. Promote private sector development, fiscal consolidation, et cetera, et cetera. So we discuss those, but we don't rate them. What we do rate are the prior actions, which is the conditionality. And here, the most important thing for us is prioritization. We're not looking for perfection. We're not looking to improve anyone's scores on any particular index. We have something called the Systematic Country Diagnostic. The bank produces it, and it combs through all of the analytical work and identifies what the most binding constraints are. So part of our assessment of relevance would be whether or not the reforms that the bank has decided to support amongst the country's full reform program are those that are particularly binding to the achievement of development objectives. Then we would look at how that's translated into what we call prior actions, and those are the specific things that a country is asked to do before there can be a disbursement. This is just one movement along the results chain. We don't expect the prior action to be sufficient to achieve your objective, but we do expect it to make a meaningful movement along the results chain. So when we look at individual prior actions to assess their relevance, we'll ask ourselves, is this going to meaningfully move you along the results chain? If the prior action is draft the terms of reference to establish a working group to draft a piece of legislation, for us that's not a particularly relevant movement along the results chain, and we're unlikely to rate that prior action as relevant. If it's addressing a necessary condition for a reform, change in regulations, change in legislation, for us that would be a meaningful movement. The other thing we do that we haven't done before, and I think this is perhaps part of the reason that there's some skepticism about budget support operations, is we now explicitly rate the relevance of the results indicators. I think in the past, results indicators didn't get enough scrutiny, and so countries would meet the targets, but the indicator itself either didn't capture the impact of the prior action or progress toward the objective. And therefore, it wasn't really convincing evidence that the operation itself had an impact. If a country, if the target is met and we have deemed that the results indicator is not relevant, we don't consider that evidence of success, and we will rate accordingly. If we consider the indicator to be relevant, then meeting the target is evidence. If there isn't sufficient evidence, we would expect the bank team that's prepared the self-assessment to provide additional evidence. So I think this raises both the standard of proof on whether or not the operation has had impact, and we're hoping that over time it will mean more scrutiny over the prior actions. And if you have more scrutiny over the prior actions, you'll have more impactful prior actions and hopefully more impactful operations. I guess the last thing I would say is in the past we used a project framework for evaluating bank performance, and the criteria were quality at entry, quality of M&E, quality of supervision. Those are not really the relevant concepts when you're talking about a budget support operation, which is an engagement tool. So it's been replaced by things like whether or not the operation is based on informed risk-taking, and that's why we look at the quality of the discussion of ex-ante risk. We don't want the bank not to take risks because it's afraid of getting bad ratings on its projects, so we want informed risk-taking. And so if we see that happening, if we see good mitigating measures, if we see good collaboration with donors, we will rate bank performance highly. And our hope is over time that the rating of bank performance will get a little more attention than it does now. The focus is on overall outcome, and the problem with focusing on overall outcome as the definitive measure is you can do all the right things, the country can do all the right things and end up with unsatisfactory outcomes because of unforeseen circumstances, shocks, natural disasters, and we don't want to disadvantage anyone in those situations and lead to unambitious targeting or anything like that. This is also a much better framework for assessing budget support operations in fragile states, where the odds of a particular reform gaining traction are a lot lower. Sometimes you don't know where you're going to get traction, and this framework allows a recognition of informed risk-taking and the fact that there's more uncertainty in certain circumstances than others. So.
Thank you, Jeff. So really a stronger emphasis on the results chain, more scrutiny of the prior actions, and also informed risk-taking and accounting for exogenous shocks. Emma, from an evaluee perspective, any quick reactions?
Yes, and it was music to my ears. I often feel that PBLs and their close relatives are judged by the standards of a project, and they're very, very different than a project. And I think some of our emergency responses during COVID, what became known in ADB as CIPROS, the Pandemic Response Option, really we were doing a lot of new and different things, and we've done those, they're being evaluated, but whether we're really in the best position to accurately judge how well they worked, are we looking at the right things and are we measuring the right things, I think is really important to think about and recognise that evaluation needs to evolve along with the tools that we're using. Absolutely quite critical to allow us to learn useful lessons and apply them going forward, because I think we all want to provide the best product we can.
Great. Thank you very much, Emma. So turning finally to Mark, you got us started by looking at the history. If you could also, in a couple of minutes, look at the future and talk about some of the opportunities for using PBLs in the context of emerging challenges, climate change, of course, regional public goods, catalyzing private investment, and so on. Thank you.
I'll try to be very fast because I think we've pretty much run out of time already, and we're taxing the audience's patience. I wanted to quickly, though, say a word about performance. If you look at performance of budget support and compare it to project support, budget support performs as well or better. And this is in the World Bank, it's in the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. There is a pattern here. Now, there are areas to improve the evaluation methodology that Jeff talked about. But there is strong evidence. If you take it down from the level of the project or operation to the question what prior actions are most effective and perform well, you find that in economic management, private sector development, you perform well in areas like civil service reform or subsidies, energy subsidy policies. They perform poorly. I think we need to pull this down to look at, you also find that first generation reforms perform well, but as you get further into many years of DPLs or budget support operations, they perform less well. I think we need to step back and take this more deeply to look at performance, but I'm supposed to be talking about emerging priorities. I think everyone here would agree that in a crisis, budget support is critical. That counter-cyclical role that Pat Ferry referred to is really important to prevent the collapse of public services, to pay civil servant salaries, etc. And it may be an opportunity for reform, but I think reform really takes a back seat when you're in an emergency. I see, looking forward, opportunities for greater innovation. I'll mention these very quickly in the interest of time. One, blended finance. We know that assistance for development finance is insufficient. We need to look at ways of mobilizing private capital. Blended finance has been talked about for a decade without really generating much leverage in private resources. I think we need to be more creative about that. There is a budget support mechanism which is called public-based guarantees. They're guarantees that are intended to bring in private finance, and closer scrutiny of that and thinking about the flexibility in those could be a very rewarding area. I'd also point to the importance of subnational reform in budget operations. We have seen use of this, and I think quite successfully, in states of India, in Pakistan. Early experience in Argentina and Brazil is very interesting and informative. I think looking at Indonesia, opportunities in Indonesia, areas where the national government is unable to really affect reforms at the subnational level because of fiscal federal relations. I think there's rich opportunities in that area. But the last area I want to mention is in global public goods and regional public goods. We all face this challenge of addressing the spread of pandemic, which is beyond borders, climate change, financial contagion. Budget support is about dialogue. It's about policy reform, and you need dialogue and policy reform to address global public goods. The challenge here is you shouldn't be robbing Peter to pay Paul. You should not take resources away from national development challenges, which are so key to the poverty alleviation objectives, in order to finance climate change. We need new resources, and I think incentives to use those resources and separating them in different pools of financing. Nothing, though, will succeed without country ownership. We've all talked about country ownership, and I want to end on that note and its importance. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I think this is an excellent point for us to pause. I know we are slightly over time, but as promised, I would like to take a few minutes to take some questions from audience. So please raise your hand, identify yourself, and also mention who your question is addressed to. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alvin Urbina from the Philippines. Currently at the OIC, director of their Monitoring and Evaluation Unit at the National Economic and Development Authority. Basically, I'd like to highlight our existing national evaluation policy framework. It has been established since 2015, and however, since its inception, there has been very limited number of evaluation studies conducted. So, despite the significant efforts to advocate for the prioritization of evaluations in government agencies, programs, and projects, we have yet to witness the desired progress in advancing the evaluation agenda. So upon reflection, it becomes very apparent that monitoring and evaluation are often considered as an afterthought following the securing of government approvals of development interventions. So this oversight leads to inadequate preparation for effective implementation of M&E. So consequently, it results in a situation where fingers are often pointed in our direction as the National Planning Agency. So speaking of budget support and technical assistance, I would be very interested in gaining insights from our esteemed panelists and of course with our fellow forum members regarding their recommendations and experiences in institutionalizing or putting emphasis in the preparation of M&E plans, including M&E capacity building activities, right from the inception of development programs and projects. So this alternative approach departs from our conventional practice regarding M&E as a secondary concern post-project initiation, but it shows great potential in ensuring the successful execution and timeliness of evaluations. So they say that if you fail to plan, then you are definitely planning to fail. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this. Did you want to direct your question to anybody in particular at the moment?
Anyone from the panels? Thank you.
Who wants to take up?
I'll say
Mark,
a
yes,
very quick response to that. I see no reason why M&E institutionalization could not be an effective prior action or continuing action in programmatic support. Earlier in one of our panels, our Auditor General from Maldives, I believe, was mentioning the similarity between audit and evaluation. Audit is a function that has been supported, and I think relatively successfully, in budget support operations. And I would see that as being a real opportunity that's probably already being used in some countries. Fully support that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any hands. Oh, yes,
Good afternoon,
please.
everyone. Yeah, very interesting discussion, in fact, yeah, about budget support and also how to make it more sustainable, yeah? Emma, in your talk, you were talking about, it's not good to put in money into a leaking budget, actually. That means budget support every year is not something sustainable for the development banks, in fact. Yeah, when the government has massive salary increases, massive funding to SOEs, it's not something that's sustainable. But I would like to know, as a result of evaluation by any of you, just tell us some examples by anonymizing the names of the countries where, as a result of evaluation, there was some better reforms to the government policies and the budgetary process. Yeah.
Who wants to take that up? Anyone? I think one question was addressed to Emma, no? Yes.
Perhaps I will start off.
No.
I said that in recognition that leading up to budget support, we will do many years of technical assistance support, project support around budget, public financial management. And we are working in a number of countries in that area where we're not yet doing budget support, and we probably won't be for quite some time. So I think it's important to look at it in that respect. I would argue we certainly learn both from external evaluations, but also importantly from our own program completion into self-evaluations. And that's really important in sharing learnings across teams. People might be on more than one country program team, and sharing those understandings, talking about, well, how did you get that reform to move in that particular country? How can we translate those lessons across to this country? I think there's a huge amount of that discussion that goes on within institutions, with government, sharing our experience from other places, from other types of reforms. And while that's not necessarily always fully captured in evaluations, a lot of it is sort of, it's no one takes notes and writes it all down, but I think a lot of it goes on, and it's very important in coming up with good reform programs and good budget support.
Thanks, Emma. You wanted to add something, Jeff?
Yeah, just to add to that, and rather than the bucket analogy, I always think of the bathtub. If the drain is open and all you're doing is pouring more water and you're not going to get anywhere, and indeed, a lot of the attention in the international development discourse has been about the mobilization of private finance. And one of my concerns is that how do you make sure that the money is being used efficiently and effectively seems to have fallen off the table to some degree in that. Mark pointed out that, in fact, PBLs have been used effectively to strengthen audit functions. And if you're looking for a concrete example, we were disseminating our country program evaluation of Mozambique. And many of you may have known that in 2016 there was this huge hidden debt scandal in Mozambique, and it led to the suspension of budget support, created enormous economic chaos. And when we did our evaluation, we pointed out that 8 years before, there was diagnostic work pointing to serious shortcomings in the system for recording and contracting debt and public investment management. And it was somewhat heartwarming when we were there for dissemination that we got an enormous amount of media attention for having pointed out that this was something that could have been fixed. And I'm happy to say that the new country partnership framework with Mozambique puts public investment management, public debt management, public financial management at the forefront. I don't think we can take complete credit, but it is nice to know that that finding is recognized.
Thanks, Jeff. I think Mark also wanted to add.
Let me make a very quick point here. We often evaluate budget support operations 1 year at a time. Project evaluation, you never do well, do that way. You look at the entirety of the project process. I think we need to be looking at 10-year periods of evaluation to get a sense of real policy reform and programmatic lending. We can all think of bad examples of budget support more easily than good examples, but if you look at a 10-year program, when I was at IAG, this is no longer practice, we looked at long periods. So we looked at Uganda, Tanzania, Vietnam, and Ghana, and I think there's a fifth one, in a 10-year profile. And there you get a much more tactile sense of how the reform is moving between programmatic periods. I would encourage you to look at that. The examples of Vietnam and Ghana, I think you'll find stand out in greater success in budget management practices.
Thanks, Mark.
We still do it.
If we are really running out of time, if there is any burning question, we could take one more question. I don't see any hands. If not, please join me in thanking our panelists and giving them a big round of applause. Thank you. Good afternoon. Now we've come to the final closing session, part of the AEW. Before we go to the closing remarks, we have special remarks from our Managing Director General, Mr. Woo Chung. So we'll show that recording and then proceed straight to the closing remarks. Thank you.
Honored guests, distinguished presenters, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to say a few words to close out another very successful Asian Evaluation Week. I want to congratulate the organizers of this year's event, your host, the Kingdom of Thailand, and all the participants who contributed to this week's success. At last year's AEW, I expressed my hope that people would be able to come together in person for this year's event. I regret that I have been unable to join you in person, but I'm gratified that you were all able to do so. Based on the feedback I received so far, it was truly an accomplished learning event. I'm particularly pleased that the event has been held in Thailand, and I join others in thanking the Thai government and the Thai people for their support. The work of independent evaluators in development is beyond important. As was mentioned earlier this week, it is critical that project and program evaluations have reach and influence. In this sense, I will mention that many evaluations undertaken by ADB's Independent Evaluations Department under the leadership of DG Manny Jimenez have indeed had an impact on our work as a development institution. One good example is IED's 2021 report on climate change, which urged ADB to take a stronger leadership role for climate change action in Asia and the Pacific. The findings were presented to the 27th Conference of Parties, COP27, in November 2022. Following this report, ADB President Asakawa called for bold action on climate change and declared ADB to be Asia's climate bank. And in May of this year, he announced the creation of the Innovative Facility for Climate in Asia and the Pacific, known as IFCAP, which could significantly boost support for climate action in the region. IFCAP is a multi-donor partnership with initial donors being Denmark, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This facility will receive donor guarantee, which will increase ADB's lending headroom by up to 5 times the guaranteed amount. We're hoping that the IFCAP can also provide grant assistance to DMCs to boost their climate actions. In doing so, IFCAP will help ADB achieve its ambitious goal of providing $100 billion from its own resources for climate change action between 2019 and 2030, while addressing the poly crisis our DMCs are facing today. Increasing our capacity as the region's climate bank is one of 4 pillars of ADB's new operating model, which was launched in June this year. Others are strengthening our work to develop the private sector and mobilize private investments in the region, providing a larger range of high-quality development solutions for our developing member countries, and modernizing the ways we work to make ADB more responsive, agile, and closer to clients. Moving forward, we will continue to lean heavily, if not more so, on evaluations, knowledge, and insights, especially those of our own independent evaluation department. Let me close by saying that I'm particularly happy with the range of sessions this week has offered and the discussions on how to better measure the results of our shared development efforts. I look forward to hearing more details of the outcomes of these discussions. Along with all of you, ADB is committed to achieving a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. Kon Kut Kap, thank you for your participation and safe travels.
Friends and colleagues, following on the encouraging and inspiring words from our Managing Director General, it is really my pleasure to say a few words before I invite Mr. Lu Wei-bin, President of the Asia Pacific Finance and Development Institute, or AFDI, and DG Manny Jimenez of IED for their closing remarks. Running in its 8th year now, the Asian Evaluation Week continues to generate a lot of interest. This year, we are again very pleased to see such strong participation with over 200 participants in total, representing 58 countries from around the world, and with broad participation and representation from government, donor community, the UN agencies, civil society, evaluation association, and private sector. Importantly, it was also very refreshing that we were finally able to get together in person after 3 years and to engage with each other in a more meaningful manner than would be possible in a virtual setting. I would like to begin by briefly referring to the main message shared by DG Manny at his opening session. While the worst of the pandemic may be behind us, we certainly hope so, the development community cannot go back to business as usual. the pandemic has made a large and lasting dent on previous progress on poverty reduction and progress towards the achievement of SDGs. At the same time, countries must also now urgently address the daunting challenges posed by high inflation, food insecurity, growing inequality, and the threat from climate change, among others. This, in turn, means that to remain relevant, consequential, and influential, us evaluators must also respond and adapt to the changes happening around us. I will certainly not be able to do justice to and fully capture the richness and the depth and the breadth of discussions we've had over the past few days. But what I'll do in the next couple of minutes is try to highlight some of the emerging issues or themes that came across from the various discussions, various sessions, the various, plenary and parallel sessions. First, of course, is accountability, which is at the core of evaluation. At the outset, we must be very clear about accountability to who and accountability for what. And in keeping with the main theme of this year's AEW, we need to remember that we focus on better evaluation so that it will hopefully lead to better policy, which in turn will lead to greater development effectiveness. It is this primary objective of enhancing development effectiveness that evaluators should not lose sight of. I think the phrase used by one of our participants, better accountability for better life, succinctly summarizes this sentiment, and I think it definitely resonates with all of us here. On the other side of the coin is the importance of knowledge and learning aspects of evaluation. Evaluators have an important role to play, not only in informing decision makers and stakeholders through evaluation, but also in fostering an evaluation mindset and a learning culture more broadly. The importance of enhancing evaluation culture in organizations came out loud and clear in several of the sessions. At the same time, at the macro level, it has become imperative to strengthen the national evaluation ecosystem across countries, while keeping in mind that what works in one setting does not necessarily work elsewhere. In this process, building strong partnerships both within and across countries was also highlighted in many sessions. This is also important because it helps identify and engage with champions whose roles will feature prominently in embedding the enhanced evaluation culture. The issue of inclusiveness and partnerships, one of the sub-themes of this AEW, that this AEW clearly brought to the fore, also implies that we need to place stronger emphasis on building the capacity of and providing a robust operating space for young and emergent evaluators. While a lot has been achieved in this area in recent years, there is much more yet to be done. The importance of effective communication strategies, bringing the right knowledge to the right audience at the right time, was also another important theme that ran across several sessions. There was also considerable interest in and focus on innovation in evaluation approaches and methodologies, and on technological advancements that provide clear opportunities for evaluators. On the latter, questions also emerged about their limitations and potential pitfalls as well, including those related to privacy issues, and importantly on the need to ensure that we do not leave anybody behind and further exacerbate the digital divide. From these important messages and themes, to me the main takeaway is that as development challenges become more complex, so will the solutions in the form of development strategies, projects, and programs. So the question is, what does this mean to us as evaluators. I hope that this event has helped provide some answers and insights into this important question, which is ultimately about the relevance and influence of evaluation. Thank you once again for your participation. Let me now invite Mr. Lu Wenbi, President of AFDI, and DG Manny to the stage for their remarks, please. Thank you very much. Please.
伊曼纽尔局长，各位嘉宾、女士们、先生们，大家中午好，现在已经是中午了2023年的亚洲评价周即将落下帷幕。我想过去的3天半是令人激动人心的时候。我自己有3个体会，一是本次亚洲绩效评价周的议题非常有价值，既关注当前的热点问题，也关注了我们长期的人类所共同面对的这样的一个长远的话题，比方说可持续发展的一些问题等等。那么第2个特点是，本次会议呢参与度非常广，我们来自很多的国际性的组织，50多个国家，近200名这个与会者呢参与到今天的这样的一个活动具有广泛的代表性。那么第3个特点就是3天半的会议取得了非常丰硕的这个成果，我们各个方面的专家就绩效评价和相关的问题做了深入的探讨，充分的交流，取得了很多的共识。我想这样的一些成果对于未来更好地去促进绩效评价在推动公共资源，也包括这个私人领域的资源的分配的方面，会产生的积极的这个成效。女士们、先生们，美好的时光总是过得非常快的。那么此时此刻呢，我最想说的一个词儿呢，就是感谢。我要感谢中华人民共和国财政部和亚洲开发银行共同举办的2023年的亚洲评价周。我们也特别感谢很多的国际组织，积极参与本次活动，特别是我们很多的专家，他们从全球各地来到这个美丽的曼谷，参加这样的活动，也给了很多的好的意见和建议。那么最后呢，我也特别感谢我们所有在座的各位与会的嘉宾正是因为你们的参与才使得我们这样的一个活动呢有这么好的一个成效。我想明年亚洲评价周呢将会回到中国，我在这里呢也代表我们上海国家会计学院，也真诚地邀请我们在座的所有的各位，明年到中国到上海去参加亚洲评价周。谢谢，谢谢。
Thanks very much. First, thank you, DDG Sona, for a wonderful summary, actually, of what was a very complex and involved conference, and you did it really well. But President Liu, thank you very much for your words, especially your kind invitation. And I'm sure that everyone here will look forward to attending. Let me just end my remarks by one observation and one word of thanks to add to President Liu's own remarks. My observation is that in this forum, I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. And I was thinking that, well, we also learned a lot during our online sessions. But what was different about the face-to-face is that other aspect that some of us talked about earlier, is that a lot of the work that's done in conferences and workshops, at least half of it is done outside the formal sessions. And that's something that we didn't get during the online sessions, much as we would have liked it. When we were online, it wasn't like matchmaking on Tinder. It was much more difficult to get to know each other. And it was much easier, though, here. Coffee breaks, I heard a lot of conversations about how to follow up. As President Liu mentions, one of the distinguishing elements of AEW is the fact that we brought together not only evaluators and policymakers, but also other disciplines, auditors and communicators, in a shared mission to make development better. So my only observation is that we need to build on this network, and I consider this event and this particular session not the end, but the start of, or the restart, should I say, of the network of colleagues and friends now that we need to bring forward in the future. The only other thing I have left to do is, I don't know what you do at the end of movies. How many of you actually, at the end of a good movie, sit to look at the credits? I do. Okay. You learn all sorts of things in credits. Okay. Did you know, for example, that most of Avatar was filmed in Hunan province in China? I didn't know that until I looked at the credits. So now I need to perhaps supplement what President Liu mentioned as a collective thanks, to mention some credits that are more than due. First, of course, I want to thank MOF and AFDI. And let me mention not just Dr. Liu, of course, but Scott Liu, Professor Wang Li, Annie Wu, and Chao Chao Shen for a wonderful partnership that allowed us to come together. So to AFDI, please join me in a word of thanks. I want to thank some important partners, both here in Thailand. So the Thai resident mission in our Southeast Asia regional department, especially CD Anush Mehta, Pok Pungsafol, Nay Ambamvong, Ujit Tongsanad, Dao Kladamko. I really needed to practice more on that, but I hope I didn't get anything wrong. To our Thai colleagues in the Southeast Asia Regional Department, please, also here in Thailand, I think that we've all been impressed by the production team that enabled us to have the biggest screen I have ever seen in any conference, and all the media management events team from RP Media, and also the care and feeding that we got from the Intercontinental Bangkok, especially Kun Ploy and Kunun. And finally, of course, to me personally, I want to give a special thanks to the IED Evaluation Knowledge and Management team. Wait for it, okay? Let me mention some names. Of course, DDG, under the leadership of DDG Sona Shrestha, Sonia Chan Sandhu, Suleha Wasim, Twinkle Alonso Kalalai, Mayan Chaneco, Julian Orzal, Connie Garcia, Julie Palomares, Michi Dantayana, Brian Lazaro Chalnaik, our video and graphics specialist, Herbs Navaska, On the web, Cuchi Imperial and Val Gonzalez, and social media, Jude Defensor. So please join me in thanking them. And finally, let me join President Liu in thanking all of you for making the long trek here and really making this event what it was and how we really learned from each other. The French elegantly have a great way not to say goodbye, but to say au revoir, which means see you next time. Thank you very much.
Finally, I've just been reminded to invite everybody for a photo session. Where is it going to be? Here? So please, we cannot end a conference without a photo, so please join us.
Come on up, everybody.
This may hopefully will be.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Liu.